Okay, hello all you crazy people out there. My name is Dragonite, and welcome back to 3D Games in GameMaker Studio 2. In the last tutorial video, I created a bunch of triangles as the fundamental building block of things that are drawn to the screen, and using it in 3D. It sounds a lot less exciting than it actually is. And in this video, we are going to be applying some textures to those squares, triangles, shapes, anything really. So I made a few changes to the project since the last video. One of them is instead of making the checkerboard color blue, I made the checkerboard color aqua. And the reason that I did this is that C underscore aqua is a lighter color. As you can see right now, it's a more sky blue teal sort of color. And that's going to make it a little bit easier to see the texture underneath it that I'm going to be applying to this. Another thing I changed is that or at least I should say another thing that I'm going to change is that instead of these squares being 32 by 32, I'm going to make them 64 by 64. And the reason for that is that the squares are going to be bigger, the textures are going to be a little bit blown up, and it'll be easier to see the detail in them. If I were to apply a texture to the 32 by 32 squares, it would look more detailed than just a flat green plane, but it would be very similar to what I had in the first video, which is good if you want to check that the 3D projection is working correctly, but not super good if you want to see what the textures are doing. So I'm going to take the lazy way out and find and replace 32 with 64. Not 64, I'm sorry, with S, because I'm going to be removing the magic number and replacing it with an actual variable. And I'm going to find and replace 64. Actually, I'm not going to because there's only a few of them. I'm going to replace the gmmod 64, which is used for figuring out which color a square is supposed to be and replacing it with S times 2 because there aren't that many of them. Telephone! Good, stay unavailable. I doubt you can hear the answering machine barking out the caller ID. If you want some context as to what I said, it's just saying call from unavailable. Alright, please don't leave a message this time. Seriously, what is the streak of... When was the last time I recorded a GameMaker video and didn't get interrupted by one of those things? Alright. So let's run the game. We'll see how this looks. The squares are going to be sky blue instead of dark blue, and they're going to be spaced farther apart. That's fine. If I want to take it a step further even, let's make it 100. Now, let's make it 128. I want to keep it a power of 2. There's no real reason to keep it a power of 2, but okay, those are substantially big. That should be easy enough to see the texture once I start applying it. So before I actually talk code, I want to make sure that everybody is more or less on the same page about what textures do and how texture coordinates work.
Hey.
So I'm going to open up Model Creator for GameMaker. If I was a real 3D artist, I would be using Blender or something, but I am not, so I will settle for Model Creator for GameMaker. I'm going to... Let's see. Let me find first a model with textures that I think are decent enough for showing off. This'll do. So this is a house object. I'm going to turn on the wireframe so that you can see it a little bit better. It does not currently have a texture on it. Let me also turn off lighting too so it doesn't look like certain faces are tinted weirdly. You can see the house is composed of flat planes. Each of the flat planes is composed of 2 triangles. And I would like to apply texture to this. So I'm going to select a texture file. I will hopefully not spend too long trying to track down the file that is the texture that I want to use. I believe it's UJ default. Load alpha channel, no. I don't really care. Okay, maybe I should care. Can I reload that? And you can see there is a texture on this house. These are totally not lifted from multiple Pokemon games, by the way. So, if I go into the texture view, and you can see a bunch of other garbage in this texture image, but the only thing I'm concerned with is what's right here. These. And let's see. There we go. Each vertex in this 3D model, vertex being one of these things, is it easier to see if I turn the wireframe off? Not really. Each vertex being one of these things. If I turn on the schematic view, you can see. Each vertex is corresponding to a point on the texture image. And I wish I could zoom in further. I can zoom in further. If your models are simple and composed of flat planes like mine are, for the most part, the textures on the triangles in the model will line up nice and neatly to the graphics in the texture tile set. You may occasionally catch me mixing up the words tile set and texture as if they're the same thing. They aren't the same thing, although the way my workflow usually goes, they're pretty similar. A texture is something that you apply to a triangle in graphics speak. This, as far as the computer is concerned, could be in either 2D or 3D. And a tile set is almost always referring to a set of 2D graphics that you place on a map in 2D. A tile set is a kind of texture. A tile set is a specific kind of texture. So if I were to select the door, as you can see, and if you're not familiar with Model Creator for GameMaker, bear with me. I've selected the door, and if I were to drag around the texture, you can see that the image that is mapped onto the image that is mapped onto the door in the model is moving around. To this day, I don't know what those things are. I think those are some sort of weird fence pieces that like Gen 4, Gen 3 Pokemon use or something. I am not entirely sure. If I wanted to drag it out here, that's like some kind of hedge. I believe this is Beltram Trail leaves. Or something, probably. I'm going to return it to the door because that's what you want it to. If you were to map your textures to something other than a square, you are allowed to do that. It would look very weird.
Hey.
If you've ever seen a UV unwrap of a human face in a 3D modeling program, the texture for a human face or something, it will be similarly distorted, although in those cases, in the final product, the textures have been mapped in such a way that it actually looks normal. But that's neither here nor there. So that is what texture mapping looks like. For the purposes of this tutorial, I am not going to be all out modeling and texturing a house. That is for some other time. Instead, I'm just going to be using this grass sprite. Someday I'll bother to fix the tiling errors in this thing. I swear, that day is just not today. So, a rather important distinction to make is that when you're looking at the sprite editor, when you're looking at sprites in like a drawing tool or a spriting tool or something, the top left or occasionally the bottom left will be 0, 0, and the opposite corner will be the height and width of the image -1, 63 and 63 in this case because the image is 64 by 64 and pixels are 0 indexed. When you're dealing with textures, it doesn't matter the dimensions of the image. You could be dealing with a 16 by 16 tile, or you could be dealing with a 4096 by 4096 4K texture, which I'm sure most AAA games are doing these days. It doesn't matter. The texture coordinates will always be 0 to 1, with 0 being the origin and 1 being the opposite corner. And the reason for that is precisely so that you can switch out a higher resolution texture without having to change the texture coordinates. If you have a big complicated model of like a tree or something, and you decide one day to give it higher resolution textures, you want to be able to just swap in the new texture with the same proportions and have it automatically work without having to go and have the computer recalculate all of the texture positions, because that would be a pain in the neck.
Hey.
And then you could do other things like swap in a lower resolution texture on the fly for less powerful machines if you want to ensure compatibility with like an older machine, especially if you're developing for mobile or something. So those are texture coordinates. Since I am just creating a bunch of squares, the texture coordinates will be going from 0, the upper right, to 1 in the bottom left. Just in the same way that the 3D positions of all of these squares go from I and J, the X and Y origin, to the X and Y origin plus the size. This is going to be the texture origin all the way to the outer edge, 0 to 1. So let's run the game. That'll take a moment. That is not textured at all because I got ahead of myself. So when you come over here to where the vertex buffer is drawn, when you call vertex submit, and I hope that last video edit wasn't too jarring because I was talking for like 5 minutes and then realized there was a better way to explain things and that I'd prefer to try again. This third argument to vertex submit, the one that I left as -1 and said that I'll come back to later, this is the texture that you're going to draw. So there's a couple of caveats here. There are a couple important things to note. One is that you can't simply say SPR_grass and expect it to work. Best case scenario, it'll crash. Worst case scenario, it'll do absolutely nothing and you'll have no idea why. So, in order to draw using a texture, you need to say sprite get texture. And that's going to take an argument of the sprite index and an argument of the image index, the sprite frame, in case you're using a sprite with multiple frames. And this will extract the texture information from the sprite. Sprite resources in GameMaker themselves aren't simply images, they are collections of data which include the image, as well as things like height, width, sprite origin, and that sort of thing. And sprite get texture, this function here, will extract the image information. Now, because I have a tile set, this is not going to work. When I run the game, and if you can't see what this says, I will zoom in on it a little bit in post. Trying to get texture from a non-existent sprite. And that is because of the way the tile sets work in GameMaker. Once you create a tile set from a sprite, as far as GameMaker is concerned, the sprite itself does not exist. This is not restricted to doing things in 3D, or to doing things with vertex buffer textures. If you tried to say draw sprite, if you tried to do something like this, it would complain similarly and say that you're trying to draw a non-existing sprite. This is something that I learned approximately this morning when I was doing my outline for this video, and this hit me in the face. One thing you can do is you can, instead of say sprite get texture, you can say tile set get texture. And you can draw that instead, but as you will see in a moment, that's okay. I am trying to draw a tile set using a sprite and not an actual tile set. Take 2. As you will see in a moment, this is not quite correct either. You would expect to see the, one, you would not expect to see the, like, transparency designation part of the image here. And 2, there's a little bit of extra space on the edge of each tile set, on the end of each patch of grass, which you don't really want. So I am done with tile sets in this tutorial series. I'm going to delete this tile set resource. I'm going to come back into this room and just delete this tile layer. If you want to use tile sets, if you want to use tile layers for like the ground or something in 3D in GameMaker Studio 2, you can. You would just also want to include the include the sprites for the other things you're going to draw separately. Even if they're the exact same image, you would want to have a separate sprite for the tile set and a separate sprite for general use. So I'm going to change this back to sprite get texture. And now I'm going to run the game. And now it's going to work. You can see there is the grass texture. And you can also see the alternating colors of a light blue you can see the alternating colors of the light blue being blended. God, I can't even do it on purpose. You can see the color blending with the with each tile, giving you an interesting checkerboard look. The errors in the sprite itself is very obvious all of a sudden when they're bigger like this. So that's an introduction to texturing. I know I took this entire 20-minute or whatever video to just explain texture coordinates. I know. Why must I do things so slowly? Texturing is where things really start to get interesting. You can do some really cool things with textures. This is where games really start to look like worlds instead of just collections of flat shapes. You can see in here, not everything has a texture. Some of the ground is just a boring old red. This is one of the things I'm working on right now. But if the texture were to come off, everything would be much less interesting. Everything would be very flat looking. And if you want to start messing with shaders, you can do some really cool things like scrolling textures. This here what you see right here is a light displacement map for making water look like it's flowing, which I think is really cool. which is entirely a shader messing with texture coordinates. But that's a story for another day. I do hope that makes you excited for working with 3D in GameMaker. I will be definitely doing more of these videos now. I'm not sure what I'll talk about next. I might make an introduction to shaders video next. There are a few other fundamental things that might be better to talk about before then, though. Anyway, as usual, the code for this is going to be in the video description, GitHub link. I will try and clean it up a little bit before I post it there. Get rid of some of the old code that's not used anymore, add comments, that sort of thing. I don't have a Patreon, but if you're feeling generous and if you found this to be helpful, I do have a donation link down in the description of the video. Either way, happy game making. My name is Dragonite, and I will see you all later.